G'day, I'm Martin Keegan. I have been asked by someone from the committee of the Student-Run Computing Facility to contribute to a history of that organisation. Student-Run Computing Facility, or SRCF, is a club in the University of Cambridge, which was founded by me, Jock Bazootil, Peter Clay, and others in 1999, as we thought to establish an alternate governance framework for collective computing resource management within the university community. And this podcast is in two parts. The first one retraces the logical steps which led to the SRCF being in the form that it is, and which also looks at the context and broader environment of what was going on in the 1990s in computing that influenced the SRCF's design, and also to look at the ideas that people had, how we went about it, and what we thought we were doing, what we thought we were trying to achieve. And the second part is more the actual history of student computing in Cambridge from 1998 to 2001, detailing the sort of the people and organisations and the ins and outs of how things happened. So the point of the SRCF, as I saw it, was to enable people to run computer programs, and of course, everyone has got their own computer. By the 1990s, students would turn up at good grief. So to retrace the logical steps. In many areas of our lives, we value efficiency, the ability to get as much as possible out for what we put in. One of the ways of achieving this is automation, and automation is largely done by machines, and computers are machines applied to the business of processing information. So if you want to be more efficient, you run your programs on a computer, and they automate things that information processing jobs that you need to run. You need a place to run those machines, and in the case of some types of tasks, some types of computation, the machine needs to be findable over a network and accessible on a indefinite basis. It can't sort of disappear at 5 p.m. or at the end of an academic term. And so if you want, in the context of the university, to do a computation that somehow benefits someone else, such as running the back end of a website or something like that, then you need a machine that's going to stay up all year round, or the website will disappear. And in the 1990s, there were a lot of normally up Linux boxes that people could get access to run their programs, host websites, but they suffered the problem that they were often in undergraduates' bedrooms, or in some forgotten about research group in some department somewhere, and were ephemeral rather than permanent. So we needed some sort of permanent server that had a permanent address that people could have access to run programs either for themselves or on behalf of others in some way. Now, to have something permanent that is plugged into the network all the time and using electricity all the time, it requires in practice some form of official sanction if it's going to be on the university's network. And being on the university's network was always regarded as absolutely essential. That means that you have to have something which can be officially sanctioned, and it's much easier to be officially sanctioned if you are come across as a sort of reliable, reasonable, agreeable interlocutor. And so in the context of the university as a whole, there needed to be some kind of body of students or group of students that could persuade some part of the university to permit them to host a computer and run all sorts of strange programs on it, and make it clear that they would take responsibility for stuff that went wrong there, and that they would self-propagate and recruit their own successors and continue indefinitely. This implied some kind of way of training people or selecting people who already knew how to run computers to ensure this long-term maintenance. Now, so that's the overall logic. We want efficiency, and we want something that can provide services to other people, and therefore, if it's going to be on the university's network, it has to be sanctioned, and that means you've got to have an organisation that the university or the college or the department is happy to deal with long term. It's got to be an organisation, can't be an individual, and so on. Now, this played out differently at university level from how it played out at college level. I was at Jesus College, and there was an additional step in the logic, which was that the college has an outright ban on hosting on web servers. And we applied for a exemption to that ban because we wanted to run our own CGI scripts and dynamic content generation for all the clubs of the college. And the college said, okay, but there has to be an organization which recruits and trains students to run this thing, because we don't want, trouble if it gets hacked, or we don't want people to start relying on it, and then for the competent people to all graduate, and the people who are benefiting from that to be left high and dry. So that was the overall logical argument of why you had to have an organisation. The organisation that was set up at Jesus College was, of course, JCN, the Jesus College Network, and individuals from JCN led the fight to establish the SRCF about a year after JCN itself had been founded. Now, the broader context of computing in Cambridge at the time was that there had been various types of non-academic computing, that is, computing used for recreational purposes of one kind or another, either chatting or games or things like that, and forums and that kind of stuff. The university had been involved in the invention of computers themselves. You could literally meet the guy who invented the subroutine or microcode. And so the computing service, which is what the UIS was called at the time, had been involved in the development of its own operating systems, and they maintained this mainframe, I think, machine called Phoenix until 1994. And people who were interested in computers could have access to this system. And when it was shut down, a sort of university-wide student computing access was withdrawn. Now, there were other ways that students could get access to servers. If you were an engineer or a computer scientist, you could get access to the Thor Unix service run by the computing service. If you were a graduate or a member of staff, you could get access to a different central Unix service, literally called CUS, the Central Unix Service. And if you're at certain colleges, you could also get access to their Unix facilities. But if you were none of these things, then you had to go for one of the student boxes. For a couple of years before I matriculated, I worked for a research institute called SRI that was largely populated by people who used to be in the computing lab at the university. And the director of our lab, now Professor Pullman at Oxford, said, look, actually, there's this Unix box at Girton, which is better than the official, university and department provided stuff. And when the student graduated, it was a disaster, as some of my students had to go and find a different place to run their programs. So several years before I came up to the university, I was aware that there was this problem with a lack of access to permanent computing resources. And this was affecting the staff as well as the students. So that's the sort of Cambridge-specific part of it, apart from the computing service itself. The overall computing environment around the world was different from the present day in a bunch of important respects. There were basically no mobile phones, basically no Wi-Fi, very few laptops. Mostly it was Wintel PCs, and there was a spreading Microsoft monoculture. This was regarded as somewhat threatening by many people. There was very little remote access to anything in the Windows world, and so you had to be physically present in such and such a location to get certain things done. And this was regarded by the Unix and TCP/IP people as a bit silly. There wasn't really broadband either. And so it just started to kick off in about 1998. But local calls that you used to access the internet were time charged in the UK, which meant how much computational communication you could do online was limited by your phone bill. Whereas the university had a low latency, high bandwidth network well connected to the rest of the world that wasn't metered. So the consumer world had metered communications and university had unmetered. And towards the end of the 90s, that flipped around with consumers getting unmetered communications and the university moving over to a metering system imposed centrally by Janis and Hugh Kerner, who ran the UK academic network. So there was also no Usenet, there was no Twitter, no Facebook. There was a thing called Usenet, which had some of the characteristics of Twitter, particularly the bad ones. System administration was still in a situation where Linux was not yet the dominant form of Unix, and so there were 7 or 8 different major varieties of Unix in the early 90s. That was all being shaken down, and the idea of apt-get install and downloading the full transitive dependency graph of the piece of software you wanted to install wasn't really a thing. And that just kicked in the very late 90s with Debian. Socially, there was some very odd attitudes towards computing. People would get in trouble with their educational institution for having remote access to a different educational institution. So, if you were at Oxford and you had an account on a machine in Bradford, you could be in trouble. If you were in Colorado and had an account on a machine in Cambridge, you get in trouble. I just referred to 2 cases I was familiar with. So there was this people who ran the computer networks. Some of them had grown up or had sort of suffered their deformation professionnelle in an era where computation was extremely restricted. You went with your punched cards of your program and requested that it be compiled. You had to effectively get permission to compute anything automatically, and that had fallen away, but the attitudes hadn't. So in terms of the computing service itself, there was a perception by some people, particularly Peter Beeney, that the computing service was that certain people in the computing service really didn't like Unix, in particular Barry Landy, and others thought, particularly college computer officers, thought that Windows eventually was going to take over, and this whole Linux Unix thing would die out and be a fad, and eventually everyone would standardize on one proprietary operating system. But a lot of the people working in computing at the university were suffering from terrible incentive structures. The pay structure for computer officers was terrible. Like librarians, they were skilled, but there was an objection to paying them a lot more than academics, even though on the market they might get more than certain academics. The incentives for computer officers were all wrong. And people had got into educational computing administration for the wrong reasons, particularly at secondary schools. But there was a bit of that in the university as well. So examples of this was that the computing service attempted to control DNS. They tried to say that you couldn't register a DNS name and point its records at stuff on their network. They attempted effectively to ban the use of DHCP for dynamic IP address allocation in colleges, which are separate legal entities, and in departments. They tried to stop you from using one computer as a Ethernet bridge for another, and these kinds of things, because it made their network, as they saw it, their network, less legible. So As far as I was concerned, the governance structure for the computing service was broken beyond any hope of repair or reform. It had effectively been subject to producer capture. That if you could just not have to use the computing services, that would be better. And, and the problem was more the communications rather than computation services run by the computing service. The computing service ran some good Unix machines, but they were restricted to particular classes of university member, which were staff, graduates, and undergraduates doing particular subjects, but it was not generally available to undergraduates. So the computing service was governed by the IT syndicate, and there was I think the director of the computing service reported up into that. But the IT syndicate had one student representative on it, a nice guy called Matthew Levy, who was also from Jesus. And really, if you disagreed with the computing service policy, did you really want to get down into the nitty gritty with them about what the permissions should be on how CGI scripts should work or something like that? There's no way you could take something like that to a committee like the IT syndicate, and students only had one vote on the IT syndicate in any case, and he wasn't really elected. So using the formal channels of the university was not going to get the services that people demanded run in the way that they wanted. So in summary, the computing service had an effective monopoly on the internet access that was enjoyed by students, because there was no broadband in college rooms, there was no mobile phones, there was no Wi-Fi. But there was the computing services excellent CUDN and the broader Janet network through which you could get to the internet. The computing service did not, however, provide all undergraduates with access to an always-on Unix or Linux box. It provided that to some undergraduates, and colleges and departments provided it to their own particular students. But the university computing service didn't have any objection to other people providing a Unix box. In fact, most of the objections to that came from other students. So if you look at the division of responsibilities, there was, at the university level, there was academic computing, which was handled by the computing service, financial and administrative computing, which was handled by MISD until the scandal, and social and recreational and exploratory investigative computing, and computing in relation to sports clubs and so on. All the sort of informal life of the university, some of which is itself academically important, that wasn't handled by anyone. And whereas some people had an objection to direct competition with the computing service, in particular Matthew Levy, there wasn't an objection to students clubbing together to provide services which the university could not, would not, or should not have provided itself. And that left an opening for an organisation like the SRCF. We conceptualised what we were trying to achieve via what Peter Clay called the first-class citizen of the internet. And this was a program which was able to send and receive arbitrary data. You're not really on the internet if you can't both send and receive information. Now, receiving is the hard part. You need to be able to run a server if you want to receive arbitrary data rather than just data which is in response to stuff that you have sent. So some types of computation require receiving arbitrary data, such as servers. If you are running a booking system for your club, or you are automating the college's room ballots, or you're providing some other kind of dynamic content generation, then your program needs to be a first-class citizen of the internet, as Peter Clay would have put it. So this means a stable internet address whereby other programs can find your program, and it requires always being switched on, and it requires a constant internet connection. Now, constant internet connection is not, that's a solved problem. It was actually having the machine always switched on was the hard part, given the propensity of undergraduate boxes to disappear over the holidays. So, alongside the first-class citizen concept, I came up with what I called the home host, which is basically a always-on computer where you can create arbitrary programs able to send and receive arbitrary data. And so the objective was to have a home host, a sort of place that these first-class citizens of the internet could call home. We didn't really bandy about this silly terminology, but that was the overall idea, that that you did not want to be in a situation where other people controlled the choice of programs that you had, or the type of data that they could communicate, or when they could run. So we were trying to make a home host, and we made one at Jesus College, and then we made one which became the SRCF, or rather, the F in the SRCF is a home host, a place where the SRCF's members can run arbitrary computer programs that send and receive arbitrary data over the internet. The other guiding ideas were as follows. We wanted to detoxify the student computing brand, rightly or wrongly, or a mixture of both. Students involved in computing or interested in computing were perceived by some parts of the university authorities as so disagreeable as to preclude certain types of cooperation and collaboration, and we felt that it was essential to counteract that. So effectively we had a PR exercise to do. We, of course, did not use phrases like brand detoxification at the time. The next thing was, and this was an actual stupid name we had, was Project Ragamuffin. And Project Ragamuffin, the rag comes from rag, as in the university's charity, the student charity. Project Ragamuffin was the idea that you would have websites that mattered to people who don't normally care about computing, hosted on a machine as a sort of human shields, or organizational shields. So if someone tried to shut down the machine, they wouldn't just be arguing with the computer. The sort of computer community of students, they'd also be arguing with people who were involved in the student clubs whose websites were going to be shut down in the crossfire. And the website for RAG was situated on the Jesus College student server precisely for this reason, and I think later transferred to the SRCF. But the idea of using of making these always on hosts useful and something that people relied on, that idea was called Project Ragamuffin when it was conceived as a sort of a political defense mechanism for the computer itself. Using by involving these various organizations that had nothing to do with computing directly in it by hosting their websites there. So that was deliberate and quite explicit, and we called it Project Ragamuffin. We had these two slogans, which were "Do it right" or "Do it now," emphasizing the trade-off between correctness and timeliness, and that is how the SRCF constitution got to be the way it is. And the and the phrase "make inertia work for you." We thought, well, actually, if inertia is keeping stuff that's running well, that's a good thing. And what we need is for the benefit of inertia um, uh, to go to things which we like, and not things which are broken. Um, we had one bad idea which caused a lot of trouble, and that was uh, you having a NIS and NFS cluster for student personal machines. In corporate environments, this was normal. I had worked for several years before being an undergraduate in this institute where everyone had a Unix server under their desk, nice sun boxes, running Solaris, and if you did CD into the right directory, it would mount that directory off some other machine elsewhere in the building. So you'd CD slash export slash name of host slash, whatever whatever files you wanted to get. So you could use the Unix file system to browse files on other machines. And usernames and passwords were kept synchronized between these machines via a system called NIS. Now, this only works if there's a lot of trust between all the machines. Now, in the case of a company, well, you can easily guarantee and enforce that, though it doesn't really scale very well. And at Jesus in particular, and I in particular, pushed this idea that we should have a system whereby people could see each other's files and share each other's resources in this way. It's extremely convenient to be able to use normal file system abstractions to access data that people have chosen to share, but it kind of relied on people understanding how file permissions worked, as file permissions tended to be default world readable, and it also compromised the security of the hosts involved, as you could often from the NIS server get root on the clients, and no one was particularly sure that wasn't going to cause problems. It caused political problems galore, and it was a mistake. It was an attempt to apply a sort of communitarian model in an area where it shouldn't have been applied. It's something that works inside small companies. It doesn't work in communities of undergraduates that could be dozens or hundreds or thousands of people. And I was completely wrong. So those are the sort of concepts that we were dealing with that we thought were important. In particular, creating machines with the explicit goal of enabling people to run arbitrary programs that could send and receive arbitrary data. That is, individuals can run servers where server is a process, but those servers, in the sense of processes, need to run on a server in the sense of a machine. And so we were in the business of getting those machines set up on an organized long-term basis. So the SRCF, when it came about, was the third generation of these home hosts. The second generation was the JCN managed servers at Jesus. And they had some governance problems as the governance arrangements kind of predated having the machines. And the SRCF took the good bits of the JCN, JCSU governance arrangements and ignored all the legacy stuff. But running these on the basis of an organization was second generation. The first generation was the justly famous Chiark, run by Ian Jackson, and other machines like Talisa at Keys and Xanadu in Peterhouse, and Callisto in Girton, this machine whose shutdown so perturbed Professor Pullman. So the SRCF benefited from hindsight there. What we thought we had learnt in the experience with JCN and the JCSU server was the following set of policies, and there are 6 of them. One, there shouldn't be a popularity contest for root access. The only people with root access should be competent people who've been vetted. Secondly, that the system ought to be, in principle, available to all students, not just people who are qualified by virtue of being of a particular subject or a particular, or being a graduate or being at a particular college. Thirdly, that we should use real CRS IDs for usernames. You shouldn't get to choose your own username. You get the username that the computing service allocated. Fourthly, that the use of group identities in the Unix sense was to be mandatory. I know you can only have 16 of those in some versions of Unix, but if you're doing anything that's part of a collective endeavor that's going to outlast one individual, it should be done using Unix groups. When I was chairman of the SRCF, that was actually mandatory. You were not allowed to run a group project out of a personal account. You were positively encouraged to register an arbitrary group with the SRCF. They were called societies in the SRCF, still are. Fifthly, there shouldn't be competition with the official provision by universities or colleges. And this really came from Matthew Levy, who didn't like students cocking a snook at the authorities, for a whole bunch of reasons. He was right. We needed to have the right attitude to these things, and saying, "Oh, we're better than the computing service," was never something the SRCF was in. It wasn't a game we were in, whereas JCN, not all of us, all of the time, avoided competing with the college's official computing staff, and there was a little bit of friendly and sometimes unfriendly competition, where JCN would be effectively holding itself out as offering to do better stuff that the college staff are being paid to do, and that has a lot of problems with it. But in the case of the stuff that the SRCF does, well, the computing service does not and did not provide a non-academic computing resource to all undergraduates, and that was that. So the SRCF isn't competing. And the 6th thing was unvetted CGI. This is the first-class citizen of the internet thing, the home host thing again. That is that individual users ought to be able to write programs that are the recipients of communication initiated by third parties across the internet. So students should be allowed to run, if not servers, they should certainly be allowed to run CGI scripts. You have some fight over the namespace of who gets which TCP ports and who gets which bits of the HTTP namespace, but so long as everyone's coordinated on namespace, people ought to be able to have programs which receive and send arbitrary information, subject to these concerns about competition over namespace. So those were the policies that we developed before the SRCF came along, or before we constructed it, and we built those in, and they have largely remained unchanged.